Welcome everyone to the UMass Computational Social Science Institute seminar series. I am absolutely delighted to welcome David Lazer to our seminar series. David is University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer Sciences at Northeastern University. His research sits at the intersection of network science, computational social science, and collaborative intelligence. His work has appeared in some very prestigious journals such as Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and the American Political Science Review, and has also received extensive media coverage by NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He is, to my mind, a really central figure in the field of computational social science, particularly stemming from an article I frequently refer people to, his 2009 Science article on computational social science, which is co-authored with a veritable who's who of computational social science. He has also published other articles in science, including on the problem of big data analysis in 2014, and more recently on fake news in a 2018 article, the topic of his talk today. So without further ado, I will say that we're going to take clarifying questions during the presentation, and then we'll have a period afterwards for longer questions. And as those questions occur to you, if they are questions for the end, feel free to type them into the Q&A. And if you have a question that's a clarifying question, please feel free to raise your hand, which you should be able to do. And then I'll break in and let David know that there's a clarifying question. So otherwise, thank you very much, David, for joining us, and look forward to your talk.
Thank you for having me, David, and thank you to everyone who's joining in from their attics, like my attic, and basements, and elsewhere. It's a particular pleasure because of UMass's prominence in the area of computational social science. I remember conversations around a decade ago as the efforts to institutionalize that were moving forward, and it's exciting to see it come to such exciting fruition. And you have so many amazing people. So again, it's an honor to virtually visit. So let me see. So I should begin by acknowledging my collaborators on the core things that I'm presenting here, Nir Greenberg, Kenny Joseph, Lisa Friedland, and Brian Swire Thompson, who were co-authors on the 2019 science paper, which will be the center of what I'm talking about today. And this was very much a collaborative effort, and we all work very hard on this research. So important to acknowledge that. So I begin with a question. Does Finland exist? Well, you might think, of course it exists. But there is a spoof post in Reddit about why Finland is just it doesn't exist. We believe it exists because of this vast conspiracy. And it seems like this spoof post then resulted in perhaps some people taking it seriously. And the key elements of that conspiracy, it's sort of interesting to reflect on, is that the argument is that this was a result of an agreement between Russia and Japan in the after the war in the early 20th century, and that the landmass that we think of Finland is really just a part of the Baltic Sea, and Japan is fishing rights there, but they're trying to hide it from the rest of the world. And that part of the conspiracy here is that there's this forged GPS and satellite imagery, and the real clincher here is that Finland is really truly an implausible country because no country in the world could possibly be that good. And I have to say that when you dig into this, you start to say, well, does Finland exist? Of course it does, but it's an interesting question why we believe what we believe, and why we say certain things are true. Um, you know, I think in a democracy, and this is particularly acute at this moment in terms of the quote unquote debate over who won the election, and I put quotes around that because I think the facts here are pretty clear that Joe Biden won the election, is that democracy rests on the assumption that as citizens we have agency, we have choices, and that we have knowledge to understand those choices. And you know, some of the critiques of democracy or the radical critiques is that in fact we have minimal choice, that we are constrained, and that we really have minimal opportunity to exercise agency. But in any case, the normative assertion around democracy is in some sense that the people are sovereign and that we can exercise that sovereignty because we know what we're doing. But knowing what we're doing is really important. So that leads to the question: what are the structures of democracy? Some of those structures might, and by structures I just mean things that are really hard to change. Like when we in the social sciences, you know, we think of the metaphor structure of there's something hard here that I can't really push through very easily. So like I can't push, you could get through a wall, but it's not very easy to get through a wall. And we can similarly think of things in democracy that are like walls and furniture, and they can be changed, but with great effort, and in any given moment, they're sort of taken as given, right? So like in the US, we might say, we don't love the Electoral College, and maybe that can be changed, but in the short run, that's structural, right? And so of the many structures around a democracy, and one that's discussed a lot is around how we get information and how we understand our choices. And so that's really why, in some sense, thinking about the role that the internet plays and how we get information is really quite central, since the internet is so central to how we get information, how we become knowledgeable about our choices. And I think that's the motivation behind why I'm looking at what I'm looking at here. Now, I'm a network scholar, and I see networks everywhere. But when we think about knowledge, in some sense, it's intrinsically a network phenomenon. Like there are some things we know because we directly experience them. Those are like non-network things. So like I know what is on my top of my bookshelf there because I'm looking at the top of my bookshelf, and I can see what books are there, and I can directly observe that. Now, if I tell you that, like you can't see what's on the top of my bookshelf, but like one of the books is How Behavior Spreads by Damon Santola, right? You now know that because I told you. But how do you really know that? Maybe I'm just like trying to fool you. But you know, I just so you know, I'm really not, right? Here it is. It really was on top of my bookshelf. And now you know that in some kind of more secure way. But as a general principle, what we know is derived from people we know and sources we trust, right? And most of those sources are, in fact, developed by people. We have diverse understandings of the world that you know, tend to cluster together in the network. That is, the people you know tend to have correlated with beliefs as you, and you know, some of that's due to social sorting, some of that's due to social influence. But my guess is that let's say people who let's say believe Biden won, and I certainly believe that, know each other, but then like the minority of people are like, well, Trump, it was a fixed election and so on, that they're also sort of clustered together, that understandings of the world are sort of somehow clustered together so that we develop a shared understanding of the world with the people around us. And that the challenge for democracy, but also the promise of democracy, is that somehow, with those diverse understandings of the world, Democracy is what happens in the spaces in between the network, and that's that we have institutions, we have mechanisms by which people with diverse understandings of the world have to converge on decisions. I mean, some of us may be happy, some of us may be unhappy, and like I said, we are in that process of reconciliation right now in this country. So, returning to Finland, why do I believe in Finland? Well, there are a whole bunch of reasons. I've seen it on maps, right? So, so that's a trust in a physical object that was created by people who are trying to sort of semi-accurately portray the world. It's been mentioned in history books, right? The Helsinki Accord, for example. I've co-authored and employed people who claim to be Finnish, right? So it would be odd if they were sort of in on that conspiracy. So of course Finland exists, but how do I know that? It's not like I was born with that knowledge. It's because I've been getting signals in the air, right? I mean, not literally in the air, but like, well, sometimes I guess television. But like, I've read stuff, I've talked to people, and I can't like identify a moment where I became a Finland believer, but it's just sort of part of those ambient influences on what I believe. And of course, presumably the same thing is true of all of you. So all of this gets to the role of our understanding of the social, of the reality of the world, around policy and civic information. And a lot of these things are quite distant from us. I mean, some of them are physically distant, like what is happening in Azerbaijan and Armenia right now are quite distant from most of us. Or they may be distant in terms of our expertise, right? Like, there have been reports on the effectiveness of vaccines, and I sort of semi-believe those reports, but part of that is around the epistemology of the system. I think there are reporters, there are scientists, there are reasons why they're trying to be accurate, but is that ultimately going to be that this particular vaccine that was announced a few days ago will be distributed with 90% effectiveness? All of that is with some degree of uncertainty, right? But generally, I know and more or less trust that information because I trust the news stories, I trust the scientists, and so on. So today I'm going to talk about the topic of fake news. We had collaborators and I have had two papers actually in Science and Fake News. One was sort of an overview piece on the science of fake news and talking about the many things we really don't understand. And really by that, we were just talking about misinformation more generally. And then the second paper was looking at the prevalence and sharing patterns of fake news during the 2016 election. But because, this is meant to be an academic endeavor, I really want to I'm going to focus a lot also on the methods, because really there was a lot of wrestling with the methods, and I think we did a pretty good job, but imperfect job. And I want to sort of put out on the table what some of those imperfections are, in part because that's how we move forward in science. And in particular, as we develop a synthesis of computer science and social science, I think there's a lot of epistemological reflection that we have to do. So I'm going to talk about fake news in the 2016 election. We're working on updating that for 2020, but it's a little too fresh still for me to have up-to-date results for that. I will talk a little bit about analyses we've done on COVID at the end, and hopefully you'll find that interesting. So what do we mean by fake news? And I should note there's some controversy over the use of the term. But I'll give you our definition and also mention the sort of controversy. Basically, we define fake news as being misinformation with the trappings of legitimately produced news, but without the underlying organizational processes. So any of us could set up a website that sort of looks like a newspaper and then just make stuff up, right? And that would be fake news. It would be making the pretense of having all that underlying editorial process of a traditional news media outlet, but without any of the organizational processes. And so that's meant to be a conceptual definition, and it doesn't, and that's also, well, I'll talk about how we then operationalize that, but it's really meant, it's meant to capture the idea that fake news is pretending to have this epistemological foundation that it really doesn't, that there are professional standards in journalism that are meant to sort of get at the truth. And I'll say that, you know, as someone who's occasionally had his research reported on, that report, there's often something lost in translation between what I know to be true and what then gets to be reported, and I'm know that must be more generally the case. But nonetheless, there is an editorial process around confirmation of facts, getting multiple sources, having editors review it, and so on. That is meant to be sort of like the equivalent of a scientific process, but for journalists. Now, the reason why the term is controversial is because it has been used as an epithet to attack legitimate news sources, right? So like Donald Trump calling the New York Times fake news is not just Donald Trump, but really leaders with authoritarian tilts around the world have called news outlets that have unfavorable reporting fake news. And so the use of the term has become controversial. We have stuck with it because it actually does refer to this very particular, not all misinformation, but a very particular phenomenon, which is sort of this counterfeit or ersatz news that I think that is really important to capture. And it's a term that's been used in various fashions really for a very long time. I mean, it goes back at least to it really is coupled with the slow emergence of professional standards in news reporting, because you can't have fake news without sort of real news that has real news criteria. But it's really been a term that, for example, peaked in the 30s and 40s, along with terms like propaganda and so on. Anyhow, it's meant to be, I would see it view as a subgenre of misinformation that is particularly pernicious because it undermines legitimate sources of news. That is, in some sense, it hurts you, it hurts the body public, both because it misinforms them, but also because it undermines trust of legitimate news sources. So, and this is just an example of something that talks about fake news in the public, that talks about the role of technology in facilitating, rapid propagation of misinformation, and this is from Harper's Monthly in the 1920s. Right, so the idea and the term and the concerns around fake news go back a long way, and in part, again, the reason why it was arising in the 20s is that there was an effort to professionalize news, and there was this effort to say that's not us, right, and that the democracy really needs legitimate news that informs us. So. Of course, things have changed quite a bit. I mean, in some sense, when we think about the wires and AP, there's some very similar things, but in some ways it was very different because those infrastructures were highly centralized, and so it was easier in some sense to control and get your arms around the spread of misinformation 100 years ago. So what I'm going to talk about today is what was the frequency of fake news exposure and sharing among voters on Twitter? Which individuals were predominantly affected by fake news? And then I'm going to look at the structure of sharing. That is, how does this fit into the broader ecosystem of civic content and political content being shared? So first of all, why Twitter? Well, I think that it's clearly a conducive medium for rapid dissemination of information. It doesn't necessarily encourage careful scrutiny because it's just, retweet, retweet if you see something that you agree. It therefore creates potentially favorable conditions for fake news. It's clearly important as a place for civic discussion. It is very much the public square in public discourse. So it's not the only place, right? I mean, we have a platform like Reddit, but Reddit is much smaller than Twitter, and obviously has different kinds of structures, definitely worthy of study. Facebook is much larger, but it's also clearly doesn't have that same objective around public discourse. It also clearly has areas that are dysfunctional, which we'll get to here, but there's no doubt, just anecdotally, you can see crazy stuff on Twitter. It's not that hard to find. So those are the general questions, but then the story within the story, in some sense, may be just as or more important than the substantive story here is the methodological story, right? Because in some weird sense, we're talking about an epistemology, a way to develop knowledge about how you develop knowledge for the public sphere. So there's sort of like this multi-layered thing going on here. So it becomes particularly a challenge to think about, counting is so hard, right? I mean, ironic to say in the current moment, but counting is a very basic thing, both for democracy, but also for at least quantitative science. And so, so the question I have here is, let's say we're computationally trying to say, we're using image recognition software, and we're saying, how many people are in this picture? And probably most computational methods that would be developed would be trying to recognize individuals. They wouldn't be trying to say, well, is that the same individual many times? But clearly the big figures here, which is this person, this person, this person, this person, is really all the same person, and that their reflection is being echoed. And so, most computational methods that you might design would say, oh, that's a lot of people. But in fact, it's primarily just one person, and then you can see sort of in the distance some clearly different people. So in any case, the essential challenge when we study social media is how to count in a house of mirrors, and using computational methods at that to count when you're trying to count things that are not just. It's not just a house of mirrors where it's sort of where it's might fool you, but where it's really trying to make purposely these phenomena are trying to make themselves look bigger than they really are. So this gets back to the question of, in terms of the big data, about the measurement conundrum of looking at, let's say, residue of administrative systems, that when we see people tweeting, a key strength here is that we are capturing real behavior, and I would contrast that to surveys where even when we're asking about behavior, we know that people's answers are often aspirational. Like, we know that if we ask people if they voted in the election, that the numbers we get, even with a good sample, will be higher than the reality, because there's a normative component. That is, most people think they should have voted even if they didn't. But the problem is that how I use Twitter might be very different from how you use Twitter, right? Like, maybe I use Twitter just to talk about academic stuff, right? Whereas you use it to talk about politics. And so there's sort of this vast heterogeneity and how people use these media, and also these media are very subject to manipulation. And we discussed some of this in this paper, looking at Google flu trends and talking about some of the issues in terms of why that actually missed quite badly in the end. So Twitter is an interesting scientific conundrum, and it's become like one of those go-to sources in computational social science. It includes regular people, news media, celebrities, academics who, I don't know whether they're regular people or not, and usually they're not celebrities, corporations, bots, and lots of bots, right? And so, in a sense, part of the challenge, and I think that this happens too often when we study Twitter, is that we don't distinguish between like this. It'd be sort of like if we studied nutrition and we were like studying tonnage of food consumed, and we weren't really distinguishing between like Campbell's soup and a salad bar, right? That would be really problematic. We might even get some signal out of tonnage of food consumed because it might tell us about like how much packaged food you eat or so on. So it might be correlated with outcomes, but it may in fact not enhance our understanding of the world. And so we you know, this challenge of heterogeneity of entities for study and of behaviors it's a very general challenge with studying social media. So we in our objective here, and this is something that we're continuing to do, was to homogenize at least the what we're looking at. So so rather than, you know, taking all of Twitter and saying we don't know whether these are celebrities or organizations or reporters, we were trying to get regular people and the people who are most salient to news consumption. So what we did was we were able to get access to voter files. Voter files in the US are quasi-public. We were working with a third-party vendor that had curated them. And the nice thing about voter files is that they also have certain basic demographics, so you can say something about the people. And so then our job was, and I'll give a shout out to a former student of David's, Lisa Friedland, who was one of our collaborators, and she was really key at developing the methods here, was that we developed methods to link, skip through this, link the Twitter handles to voter data. And we have more discussion of this in our paper and in the supporting materials. But basically, we had 2 million, roughly 2 million registered voters. We had a sample, and we looked for names that were mutually geographically unique. So, for example, in these scenarios we have here, we say, all right, we have near Greenberg, and you know, and so maybe he's the only near Greenberg in the voter data, great, but he's not the only near Greenberg linked to New York in Twitter, right? And that could be the case, for example, because there are multiple near Greenbergs, one of whom is registered to vote, one of whom isn't, one of whom may be a citizen, one may not, one may be too young to register to vote. So in any case, we look for names that are within the geographic location named, whether it's like Massachusetts or Boston, that they're the only name, first name, last name combination in that geographic area in the voter data, number one. And then number two, when we look at Twitter, that they're the only one who is unique I mean, they're the only one with that name in, let's say in this case, in, let's say in our hypothetical, Kenny, who's now at Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo, but at the time, let's say he was in Boston, Massachusetts, and that he was the only Kenny Joseph in Boston, Massachusetts in Twitter, then we would consider that a match. And it's a pretty conservative matching approach. I should note, I'm not going to discuss this now. We actually have a paper under Revise and Resubmit where we talk about some of the biases that result from this approach. I mean, generally, we compare to a Pew survey of voters, and we look at the standard survey and the proportion of people, of men versus women versus Republicans versus independents and so on in the survey versus our matching, and actually does pretty well. And we've done more digging, and we've discovered some biases, not huge biases. Well, some are sizable, but like, for example, we're more likely to match women because it turns out that women have more diverse names than men. It's not something I knew before getting into this, but like they're like Michael Smith is the most common male name, right? But I'm not sure what the most common female name, but like it's probably somewhat less common, excuse me, less common than the most common male name, and so on. And the fact that there's more diversity in female names actually makes women a bit easier to match than men. And there's also challenges in matching people. We're comparing to a survey-based approach, and there are problems in matching Asian Americans because, and we're not quite sure why that is, but we suspect that's because the names used often on Twitter are a sometimes shortened or semi-anglicized version of a name that's not the legal name. And that makes it much more difficult to match. And probably, and this is where we get the issues of sort of where sort of kinds of algorithmic biases can sneak in, that if we were talking about David and Dave, our matching systems would probably figure out that David and Dave were really the same first name and would declare it a match. But if it was a name that was of a smaller subset or smaller minority of the population, that may not be, the nickname may not be captured in any kind of matching process. So sorry to go into the weeds here, but matter a lot in terms of what we find. And in some sense, I think that our journey here is more important than the destination. We focus on political news around the election. We are focusing, because we want to get at sort of this role of a publisher, we focus on tweets with an external URL, and we then identify the domain associated with that URL. And then we train a classifier for detecting political tweets. So for example, the tweet on the left, which has misinformation and it's from a reliably unreliable publisher, that would count as fake news. Whereas on the right, this is definitely, the Pizzagate was like one of those crazy rumors from 2016. Clearly misinformation, not linking to an external website for its credibility. So we would call that misinformation, but not fake news. So that's how we operationalized it. And we're not trying to capture all important phenomena. We're trying to come up with a very precise social science construct here. So, the way we detected political tweets, and I'm happy to, I'm not going to go into this great depth, but basically we start with full text to tweet. We take tweets, we looked at certain political keywords with things like candidate names and handles and so on. It's meant to be like, if you're mentioning Hillary Clinton, it's probably about politics, right? So really trying to emphasize precision here. And then if it had something from the whitelist, we would say that was political. But then we also had this approach to extending the list by trying to come up with phrases and words that were associated with politics in the moment, because things happen on a given day. So like there was a day in October where the phrase Access Hollywood was not politically related, and then there was a day after that where it was. And so we identified words that were associated with words on our whitelist, and that added some additional tweets that we classified as political. So first question: how much fake news do people see on Twitter? And so a challenge here is what counts as seeing. And the problem here is that Twitter won't actually tell you what people saw. I mean, somewhere in the Twitter system, Twitter knows what crossed your screen. They don't know what you paid attention to, right? Like there may be things that you're just scrolling by and you're not seeing, you're not processing, but they at least know that scrolled by. And obviously, to attend to something, you have to at least be potentially in your visual field. And we can't see that. That's not within the API. So the question is, how can we estimate that exposure without having that access to Twitter server logs? By the way, I should note we're working on a better solution to this. We actually have one in the field right now, but I can talk about that later. So we were fortunate that at the time, we had access to the decahose. That's a 10% random sample of Twitter. And so we were able to take our panel members, so we had around 16,000 people, and we can see on the right, we can see everything that they shared. But then we were able to simulate a sample of their newsfeed. The decahose is 10%, so we're able to sample 10% of what they saw. And so we're able to reconstruct what people saw, a sample of what they saw, and thus be able to say roughly how much fake news you saw by saying, here's how much that you could have seen, and we can say what rate of fake news versus other kinds of news might you have seen. So the challenge I should note on this is that we don't know what Twitter does, right? Twitter's gonna, you sign on, you see certain things, but then Twitter's choosing what you see. I think back in 2016, Twitter was much lighter handed on algorithmic curation, but nonetheless, during this period, it was there. So to summarize, we had around 16,000 people, panel members, which were match voter to Twitter handles. So there were around 10 million political URLs in terms of what they were sharing, and then around 32 million impressions. And here we're working on, we said 648 million potential exposures, but like that's that's sort of capturing that's what was potentially exposed, and we're guessing that roughly 5% what you could have seen, you did see. So how did we operationalize fake news? Basically, we started with Snopes as a fact-checking site. We looked at what websites were sort of recidivist providers of misinformation. We know that there was an existing list in the literature that had come from trusted fact-checking organizations, so we called that the blacklist, and then we expanded that with red and orange categories of fake news. So just to give you some examples, on the blacklist were largely fictional websites, like the abcnews.com.co is just trying to deceive you, right? It's not, that's ABC News, it's not ABC News. The red list includes a lot of news sources that you probably may have heard of, like news quotes around this, InfoWars, Gateway Pundits, that they clearly publish a lot of falsehoods with little regard for the truth. And then orange is clearly fails fact checking sometimes, although they're less frequent and less egregious in terms of the issues. So what did we find? Well, first, very simple descriptive finding, but descriptive statistics are important in life, is that around 5% of the content that potentially appeared in voters' timelines was fake news. So that's not a tiny number. It's not massive either. So like, if we had found 30%, that would be a very different story than finding 5%. And on the other hand, 0.5% would be a very different story still than 5%. So that's not trivial. It's not massive. It's not overwhelming, but it could be enough to be consequential. But one of the things to note here is how concentrated the exposures are. And so this is a sort of a cumulative density function. So here we can see, and this is looking at all blue line is all news content and how concentrated it is. So like we can see that 1% of the panelists account for roughly a third of exposure to news content. So like it's pretty concentrated, but if we're looking at the fake news sources, we see it's even more concentrated. So like for the red and black, which are the most egregious categories, 0.1% of panel members. So that's like, that's 16 people, and not 16, that's Yeah, actually, sorry, 16 people accounted for around half of all exposure in our panel. And for red and black, and that would be, you know, somewhat less if we're also throwing in orange. But it's even more so if we look at sharing patterns, right? So 0.1% of accounts, 16 accounts were responsible for around 80% of the sharing of fake news. And so what we see is that the concentration, that there's a very distinct concentration and super sharing of fake news and misinformation. I mean, well, more generally misinformation, but certainly we're speaking to fake news here. And that's important in terms of interpreting that those average numbers, that the average is being dragged up by a tail phenomenon. I should also note that this highlights the part of the benefit of having large scale data is that sometimes your median behavior is in the tail of the distribution of people. So in this case, the median share of fake news is actually in the 0.1% of all users. So it turns out, ironically, our sample by social science standards at 16,000 is a pretty big size sample, but it turns out that's really not big enough to really say statistically rigorous things about the 0.1%. So that there is a broader lesson here, which we learn again and again around the importance of the tail. How concentrated these things are, though, does vary, right? Like, if we're talking about exposure, really 80%, 1% of accounts account for 80% of exposure. That's 160 people. That's better than 16 people, right? So in any case, this is, I think, part of the deeper truth for many things online, and has implications for why large-scale samples allow you to look at really interesting small samples. So who are these people that consume and share so much fake news? There are these super spreaders. Are the accounts human? Are they who we think they are? What are they doing, right? Like if they're not robots, what's going on? And so some anecdotal stuff. Of the sharers, we note that here are the demographics, and actually some of this interestingly holds up when we now have a sample size of around 100 times that size. So it tilts towards Democrats, towards Republicans rather, 14 Republicans and 2 Democrats, tilts towards women, and it tilts actually older than, substantially older than the typical Twitter users. There's no obvious pattern in terms of profession, interestingly, and there's no obvious geographic concentration, but interestingly, even the age and the gender and the partisanship all seem to hold up to larger scale samples. When we drill down in some of the patterns we saw, again, these look like real people, right? I mean, these were not they had a broader presence on the internet. Either they were people, or they were very fancy bots that were building elaborate profiles. But it is clear, or it seems likely, that they may have been cyborgs, so they were using some automation to help them share stuff, so that there were apps that can auto retweet sources quickly. So among the 99% who saw fake news and who shared it, and here we came up with a sort of continuum of measuring political affiliation for everyone. This was in part borrowing an approach that Pablo Barbera developed to make inferences about putting people on a left to right scale in terms of news consumption. And it actually correlates very well when we look. It means there are implications both about domain level as well as people. And at the domain level, it really aligns quite nicely with other efforts to classify ideology of domains. So who saw fake news? Well, a few elements, a few key things to note here. First, that there's more exposure among older people. And so as you go looking on the right, rights panel, and we go from age from 20 to 80, we can see generally the lines go up with older people, but that the most pronounced effect is a left to right dimension, which is that there's much more sharing on the right and exposure rather on the right than on the left. We see a similar pattern with respect to sharing fake news. Interestingly, when we also then looked at retweeting of things that you might have seen, that there isn't a big effect if we're looking at, we'll call fake news and hard news, or we'll call non-fake news, that there wasn't, here we're looking at Democrats and Republicans, and we see both Democrats and Republicans. If we look at fake news on the left, and we're looking at how much a Democrat shares congruent versus incongruent fake news, they're much more likely to reshare if it's in their newsfeed. Congruent fake news, that is fake news that's on the left rather than the right. And the same thing is true on the right. I should note the huge error bar here for incongruent fake news on the right. That just reflects the fact that there's a lot less fake news on the left, and then people on the right are just very, very unlikely to come across it. So this results in an extremely imprecise estimate. But nonetheless, the point estimate is that that Republicans are much less likely to share incongruent fake news. And the same thing and the same rates are actually true. There's not a big difference between either on the left or the right on sharing fake news versus hard news, but that that generally Democrats and Republicans are more likely to share congruent real news rather than incongruent, and that actually tendency seems to be more pronounced among Democrats than Republicans. So, so final thing, and then I'll open, and then actually a postscript, and then I'll conclude. What other sites were consumed by voters who were exposed to fake news, and where did the fake news fit within the broader media ecosystem? And here, what we could do is we developed a co-sharing graph. So let's say the people who read the New York Times or share the New York Times also share the Washington Post a lot, which is actually the case. Then we'll draw an edge between the two of them. But let's say the people who share the New York Times a lot and people who share Breitbart a lot tend to be different. Then that edge between the two would be much weaker. And so what we've done in this graph I'm going to show you in a moment is to take that co-sharing graph, it's focusing on publishers and drawing edges just between domains that are shared a lot. And we use some fancy pruning techniques so that sometimes you do this if you and it's just a ball of spaghetti, a bowl of spaghetti that loses all structure. But in fact, there are good ways, sensible ways to prune that graph so that you see the underlying backbone of the graph. And so what we get is a graph that looks like this, and we have a similar version in the fake newspaper. A few things to note: that bigger circles, unsurprisingly, mean that they were shared more, and we don't do this to scale. So the ones that are somewhat bigger, it's logarithmic. So these are orders of magnitude bigger than the smallest ones. And then we color it based on how much is seen by Democrats versus Republicans, and then we fill it in if it's in our fake news list. And so obviously we see a lot more right-wing fake news than we see left-wing fake news, which we knew already. We also see, the happy thing again is that the non-fake news is much bigger, really. This is much bigger than the fake news, but also that the right-wing fake news is a very discrete corner of the ecosystem that if you share one, you're very likely to share the other. And so there's this very discrete neighborhood of Twitter that is the fake news sharing neighborhood. I should show you just some of the websites, unsurprisingly. we see here some of the very familiar domains. New York Times is the biggest. Washington Post is very large. CNN, which is I think buried underneath here, is very large. Fox News is pretty large, although much smaller than the others. And then you see like a website like the Daily Caller, which is actually trying to sort of bridge the fake news and real news. Are trying to be more mainstream, but they also have a fair amount of like made up or nearly made up content. It's sort of in this bridging content place where they're sort of connected to, let's say, for example, fake Fox News, but also then not too far from from the bigger neighborhood of fake news domains. So like the structure here really, and at least this category is much clearer on the left-wing fake news. There's much less of a discrete neighborhood, and it doesn't really even pop out very well in community detection, interestingly. So like I said, most of the political news content is coming from these 81 sites in the mainstream media cluster. And this is the postscript in 2020 for COVID. I'll point people to the COVID States Project. We actually have a bunch of stuff around fake news sharing for COVID. We look at sharing patterns for COVID misinformation. And we also have surveys and looking at patterns of misbelief from a survey. And just to give you some highlights, but like I said, you can go to the website to see more, is we get on the sharing side, some similar results. So like, again, we see here we look at age, right? So 18 to 29 on the top and older than 65. And we can see, whoa, the older than 65 is just much bigger than the younger cohorts, right? In terms of sharing fake news. And then we also see the partisan effect that Republicans are more likely to share fake news than Democrats. Again, we still see the age effect among Democrats and Republicans, but there's just a roughly almost tenfold difference, at least in the oldest category, somewhat smaller in the younger categories in terms of the ratio of rates of news sharing, fake news sharing for Republicans versus Democrats. Interestingly, from our survey, these relationships are different. We actually find, in terms of patterns of misbelief, we see, number one, that misbelief levels are higher among young people than older people. Right? And this is just sort of based on 10 common misbeliefs. I think it was 10 common misbeliefs. And we get into the details of each specific one in the report. And there are partisan differences. They're not trivial, but they're much, much smaller than on the sharing patterns. And I think this reflects that, like, there's a particular strategy around misinformation, fake news on Twitter and on social media that has a partisan kind of tilt to it, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the same for the broader public. Certainly, even on the left to right, mildly there, and then on the age gradient, it's just the opposite of what we find on Twitter. And so, so there's this fascinating inversion in terms of age. So we're working on why that is. We actually have plans on addressing that puzzle. It's a bit of a, it's a seeming paradox. I mean, it's not really a paradox because, you know, there are a number of ways that could mathematically square, but it is a puzzle that we're looking at. So conclusion, and I've talked a lot, and I apologize. I've been wordier than I meant to be. At its peak, fake news accounted for a fair amount of information being shared in timelines. So up to at the very peak, 1 in 5 political URLs were being shared. It got worse as we got closer to the election. That this is really about people and not primarily about bots. I mean, we could have thrown bots into the analysis and see how that mattered. I doubt that having bots in there would make things look better, certainly. But if we're trying to study human behavior, we're trying to, this is why we're doing this way. But exposures and sharing were extremely concentrated. So 80% of fake news funneled to just 1.1% of people, and 80% of shares came from 0.1%. That is just 16 people out of 16,000. So in some sense, this is an issue of a very seedy neighborhood of Twitter and not necessarily a broader systemic issue. Those who are most likely to be exposed to and share fake news were among the more conservative leaning and older adults. Again, how much that translates to the broader public in terms of belief may not be the case. We cannot go back in time though and survey people in 2016, but we are doing that today. And interestingly, we we saw people generally shared consonant information. And again, the co-consumption network patterns highlighted that the people who shared, it highlighted the sort of super sharing machinery to push the stuff out there, that it wasn't just about pushing one website out there, but it was about pushing many of these fake news sites out there to try to insinuate that content into the system. There are some interesting implications for designing Twitter, and my guess is that some of these things are probably already are in Twitter. Interventions for sharing can be highly efficient. So for example, targeting a few people can be just limiting how much anyone can share actually would have a major impact, just because the people who shared a lot of news content were disproportionately sharing fake news content. So if all you said was something like, no one can share more than 10 news-related tweets a day, that would actually have pretty dramatic effects in fake news sharing without any selective editing. It also highlights the potentially how easy it is to detect emerging fake news sources, because this strategy of pumping it out from a few handles means that it's easy to figure out who are the people who share fake news and what are the patterns, what are the emerging bits of fake news. It would not be hard at all actually to detect, emerging misinformation. It also highlights that you could use that kind of system to alert consumers. So in any case, I'll leave it there, and thanks for sticking around.
And one of the things I regret about virtual things is that there isn't easy to do applause. So I will try to stand in for everyone else and say very, very good talk, David. Thank you so much. This is fascinating stuff.